Hi everyone. My name is Janet. My pronouns are she, they. I'm a PhD researcher at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people as they're the traditional owners and the custodians of the country from which I'm presenting today, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. An acknowledgement of country is a quite common Australian practice, and it's quite similar to pronoun introductions in English-speaking contexts. Both of these practices challenge us to think about people's identity and how they're represented in language. However, the ways that we implement inclusive language practices that recognize people's identity can be quite different across writing systems and also between written and spoken language, as we've just heard with Camille's talk. So in alphabetic writing systems like English, creating gender inclusive pronouns is, from a technical perspective, quite straightforward because whether it's that repurposed singular they or newer forms like am, those can be typed as soon as they're conceived. And the major hurdles are really the linguistic and social acceptance. And in languages with grammatical gender, such as French, it can be a little bit more complicated, as we've just seen from Camille, but it is still possible to create those forms that are recognizable to people. In Chinese, the story is a little bit different. So the very technology that's used to type, which these days is mostly digital input, can actually prevent new Chinese characters or sinographs from being typed at all, regardless of how socially accepted they are. And so today I'm going to be discussing the critical role that written forms play in the emergence and the prevalence and perceptions of gender inclusive pronouns in contemporary Chinese. And as we'll see, the very possibilities of what can be written in Chinese are shaped not just by linguistic innovations, but by these technological constraints of digital writing systems. And just before I go any further, I just want to say when I'm discussing Chinese, I mean modern standard Chinese. When I say gender neutral, I mean pronouns or other words that don't differentiate binary gender. Gender inclusive, I use for pronouns or words that encompass some non-binary genders, and ungendered, I mean forms that don't contain any kind of gender information. So written Chinese has actually only distinguished gender in third-person pronouns for the past 100 years. In the 1920s, Chinese scholars hotly debated whether Chinese needed to have a dedicated feminine pronoun, and if so, which of the graphs that have been proposed should be chosen. And the competing graphs included this classic pronoun yi, a new graph which put a woman semantic component next to the existing pronoun ta, and a new graph which I will be calling nu ta. And the classic pronoun yi was actually quite popular with some leading writers like Lu Xun. It was also included in early Chinese grammars. You can see an example of where yi has been included in this grammar written by the missionary William Lobshed from 1864. On the other hand, Lu Xun's brother, the writer Zhou Zuowen, favored ta nu, which has got this subscript women component next to the existing pronoun, when he translated Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Match Girl in 1919. But ultimately, it was the new ta that succeeded over its competitors. And the reasons that that happened tells us a lot about what makes orthographic innovation possible. So drawing on Huang's research on the adoption of this new ta as a dedicated feminine pronoun, we can identify three important factors for the successful introduction of a new graph. It needs to meet a genuine social need. It should unambiguously convey the meaning and the pronunciation. And perhaps most importantly for our discussion, it needs to be practically usable by ordinary people in their writing. But while modern Chinese has now had a gender-distinguished third-person pronoun system for a century, this distinction actually only exists in the written forms. So the equivalent of he, she, and it are all pronounced ta in Mandarin. And in Taiwan, they have another two pronouns, and they're also pronounced ta So the gender distinction is made through the semantic components in the characters. In the original ren ta, which is now used only for men, it has a human component on the left. In the newer nu ta for women, it's got a woman component on the left with the same phonetic component on the right. And so this is what we mean when we say that the nu ta graph unambiguously conveys both the meaning that it's dedicated for women and what the pronunciation should be. In the past decade, there have been several new gender-inclusive pronouns that have emerged, and some of these imitate the structure of the existing binary pronouns, and they follow the principles of Chinese character grammar. So that these two new proposed sinographs, which I'm going to call wu ta and x ta, they feature a semantic component on the left side, which is either none for no gender or x gender, and they reuse the same right component as are in the existing established binary pronouns. There's also this romanized form pronoun, ta, and some scholars have further proposed broadening the use of dialect pronouns, which are these two, or reviving the pre-20th century use of the ren ta for all people regardless of their gender. So in my research, I've examined the prevalence and the perceptions of these emerging pronouns through corpus analysis and also a survey of queer Chinese speakers. And the corpus data reveals that while the ta appears frequently online, the proposed gender-inclusive sinographs like the x ta are still virtually absent. The x ta and the wu ta, at the moment, they mostly only appear in some queer forums. But this kind of pattern isn't merely about people's preferences. It actually reflects the fundamental constraints on what can be typed. And so these new sinographs aren't encoded in Unicode, and it makes them impossible to input through standard methods. And at the moment, they can only be displayed as images. There is some movement on this. In 2021, the UK actually submitted a proposal to the Ideographic Research Group of Unicode to add the x ta to the CJK Unified Ideographs block. However, even if this is accepted, the implementation won't occur till 2026, which is over 10 years since this pronoun was created by an intersex community group. And this highlights a fundamental difference from a lot of alphabetic systems in that in Chinese, the technological infrastructure can create very absolute barriers to linguistic innovation, and no amount of social acceptance can overcome that. So in my survey of queer Chinese speakers, it reveals how people navigate these kind of constraints. And the survey findings indicate that people's preferences and their impressions of gender-inclusive pronouns are actually strongly influenced by very practical considerations, which is what we call readability, pronounceability, and the typability of these kind of pronouns. And so I'm going to briefly share some of the findings of the survey that illustrate this. So about a third of the 103 respondents to the survey were gender diverse, and that encompassed quite a number of different categories. A quarter of the respondents were cisgender or trans men, and the remaining 45% were cis or trans women. ta was used by 10% of all of the survey respondents, and this rose to 70% of the trans and gender diverse respondents. Overall, the gender neutral or inclusive pronouns made up almost half of the pronouns that the respondents used, but no one reported using these new sinographs x ta or wu ta. But the ta was very widely recognized and well received by most of my survey respondents. It was as well recognized as the established binary pronouns, the ren ta and the nu ta, with a recognition rate of 97%. In contrast, less than 10% of the respondents had ever seen these two sinographs before, and if they had, they'd mostly only seen them once or twice. Importantly, though, there were actually no significant differences in how frequently the participants had encountered the TA based on what their gender was, how old they were, where they came from, or what pronouns that they used. And that suggests that this TA is quite versatile as a pronoun. It also received the highest percentage of positive comments from the survey respondents, and it had the fewest negative comments at 15% among the major pronouns for which I received comments. And you can see that the renta, which is now used for men, had a much higher percentage of negative comments. So similar to the English singular they, the TA can function as either gender neutral or an explicitly gender inclusive pronoun. However, there were some participants who considered this Romanized pronoun to be inappropriate for written Chinese. And so some people said, I use it often and I find it very convenient, but I also understand some people think that TA breaks the coherence of Chinese. Another said it was untraditional and only used by young people on the internet. But someone else said it was user-friendly and inclusive, and it was their personal favorite. Again, we got this contrast view of the look and feel is good, it suits people's everyday pronunciation habits, and it doesn't create issues with having to specify someone's gender. So we can see that the respondents touch on these kind of two elements of it's practical and convenient, but it may not be ideal as a real Chinese character gender inclusive pronoun. However, they were very aware of the practical barriers to adopting such a pronoun. And so what they said about the wuta is that it's good, but it's hard to type and it takes a long time to explain. Many computer systems cannot display it, so people can't use it. Xtar, similarly, people said, if it can be added to the Chinese character system, it would be a good gender neutral pronoun, but it's not very suitable for writing at the moment. And you can see that in the way that I have to represent this on the slide is that, the two components should be close together, not split out the way that I've got them. My corpus analysis then shows how these individual pronoun choices scale up to institutional adoption or not. So the TA has found a niche in mainstream discourse, with major social media and e-commerce platforms using it for gender neutral references to their users, and individuals often use it for privacy reasons. And this kind of broader utility might be really essential for achieving mainstream acceptance. But of course, we need to do some more research examining what non-queer communities think about these kind of pronouns. In the corpus analysis, I found that there were almost 16,000 tokens of ta being used as a pronoun. It was often used in a plural case when people didn't want to imply by default that everyone was a man, which is what you have to do currently. It was also used, as I mentioned, as a convenient way for platforms to communicate with all of their users without having to do like a he/she situation. And it was also closely associated with a love relationships discourse. So when you're talking about your ideal person as abstract and, this amazing love of your life, you're Mr. Right. And so you can see this in this example that I've got from the corpus. And I'm going to read it out. This is my translation. No matter if it's a man or a woman, when you fall in love with someone, you may be attracted to their appearance, their inequalities, or even their material possessions. But never ever pour your whole heart and soul into loving that person. You must find a way to make them fall in love with you. And so this example clearly is a gender neutral case because they're saying either a man or a woman. But it's interesting that they've chosen to use this TA instead of he/she. So if you return to Huang's criteria for the successful introduction of the new ta as a dedicated female pronoun, and we apply it to the current landscape, we can see why this Romanized form ta has gained traction, while some other emerging pronouns are currently struggling. So these newly proposed sinograph pronouns, X ta and U ta, they meet a genuine social need for gender inclusive representation. And they're also modeled on the established binary pronouns in that they have this left semantic component, which is telling us about the gender or the non-gender of the pronouns, and the right component as the phonetic component, signifying that it should be pronounced ta. The romanized ta ta also preserves this conventional pronunciation for third-person pronouns in Mandarin, and it meets the genuine social need. But crucially, the ta ta can easily be typed and displayed across all platforms. And this kind of consideration is vital for achieving mainstream acceptance. So the journey towards greater pronoun inclusivity in Chinese is thus really intrinsically tied to the technological capabilities and constraints that we have. And so while the ta ta gains ground as this convenient solution, the ideal that a lot of people have for a real Chinese pronoun for non-binary and other gender diverse people is currently elusive. So unless gender inclusive sinographs are recognized in Unicode encoding standards and enabled by input method editors, then these innovative writing forms will remain too cumbersome for widespread use. And this demonstrates how the very possibilities of orthographic innovation and language change can really be shaped by the technological infrastructure of modern writing. Thank you.
Yes. Hello, I hope you can hear me. This relates to
Yes.
the comment made by David Sher recently in the previous talk. Why not just come up with a version that has only the right part of the character? So you don't need the X, you don't need the Wu, you don't need the Ren, you don't need the Nu. You just have the right character.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's really just a practical reason in that that component is already a character by itself, and it means something completely different.
Yeah.
So
to deal with that kind of, I don't think there'd be too many contexts, right? It's also, right? It's not something that would be so confusable, right?
Yeah, I think like that would definitely be possible. I'm not sure if anyone has thought of it so far, but that's a great idea. We could just take off all of the semantic components to do with gender and then just use the yeah as it's pronounced in Mandarin as a pronoun for everyone. There are actually some people who would like to go back to the classical pronouns, which didn't differentiate gender. If I go back to them, sorry. This E and the Ju. But the main arguments against doing that, or either just taking this right phonetic component, is that currently they all have different pronunciations that are not ta, and the ta seems to be really, really strong preference among Mandarin speakers that they naturally use.
Any other question? Do you know about any similar initiatives in Japanese?
I wouldn't be able to say with any confidence about Japanese. I don't speak Japanese myself or know much about it. And I'm not sure whether they would look to use kanji to do that, so similar to characters, or whether they would look to create a more phonetic component.
Okay, maybe you have a comment?
As far as I know, well, first of all, we have two separate words for he and she, and both include the he character when written. And I'm sure in the inclusive, language community, there is a proposal for another pronoun, but I'm not really knowledgeable in that field.
Okay, any other question? I have a comment by Helen McGowan. Helen, maybe you could connect and we don't hear you. Can you switch on your mic? So Helen says, I'm very interested in how input systems constrain Semitic writing. The Japanese model works were an innovation to respond to Western language similar to Chinese in that sense.
Yeah, I feel like it's only really become a very acute kind of problem now that most writing is digital and you can't choose to handwrite something if you want to, because obviously if we're mostly handwriting, then we don't have these kind of problems because you could create whatever character, whatever graph you want. But if we have to go through the process of getting it encoded in Unicode, then you need to demonstrate that there's a strong need for this graph, but it's difficult to demonstrate when people can't write it and use it, and so therefore it doesn't become prevalent. So I think it's really a kind of thorny problem that we haven't solved at the moment.
Okay, so thank you very much, Janet.